Thanks everyone for coming to the third meetup of Product Austin. I see a lot of familiar faces. My name is Prabhakar Gopalan, and I am the co-organizer with Roger Collin. Roger's here. You probably know Roger. And Josh Duncan. So thank you very much for coming back. Today we have a very interesting speaker, Andrew Allison from the MainStreetHub. How many of you know MainStreetHub? Okay, there are quite a few of you. So we are very pleased to have Andrew here to speak about designing culture. I mean, design is a very, very close topic for me, to my heart, and culture is obviously to everyone here, so it's fantastic that you've added both of them together. I just have a couple of housekeeping things to talk about, and then I'll hand it over to Andrew. One is, if you're parked in this building, you can get your parking validated, and it's $5 after that. The second is, in terms of membership, how we're doing. We have about 215 or so members now. So we've added 35 members since the last meetup. So we're slowly growing. I'd like, if you like what you see here, please bring your friends. And the third one is, the purpose of this group is to network with people who come here, like-minded people. So after this meetup, I will send in an NPS survey and also a question to you. You really should have at least one lunch or coffee date with someone that you meet here. And that's a question that, I hope you can answer. That's how we build our metric on whether we are serving whether we have met the goal of this group or not. As for the last survey and the one before, the first time, I think in the second meetup, I showed you guys what the numbers were. We had 2 people who answered our survey with a 3 and a 7 on how likely you're to recommend. Everybody had a 10 or a 9. In the last one, we have 1 person with a 7. Everybody else had 8, 9, or 10. Most of them had 10. So I think purely from an NPS, I don't have the exact number, I think we seem to be doing okay. So Andrew, you have a very...
I'll try to keep it going.
Yeah, same thing the last time the people said, and they turned out well. So as for November and December, I have a verbal commitment from 1 person who's going to be speaking here. It's going to be the CEO of AppSumo, Noah Kagan, you probably know. So, and I'm trying to bring 1 more speaker. We'll see how that happens. But that's 1. And again, we'll see whether it happens or not, depending on schedule. December is going to be awesome as well. How many of you have read this book, Traction book? The Traction, the yellow covered book. Anybody?
I own it. Does that count?
1. Okay. So if you have not, check it out, because it's an awesome book. It's very recently released, a couple of weeks ago. And the co-author of that book with the CEO of DuckDuckGo, everybody knows DuckDuckGo, the search engine, Gabe Weinberg, and Justin Mayers is the person that is going to be coming here from San Francisco to give us a talk in December, the December meetup. So I may also have 1 other person. Each time I'm trying to have at least 2 speakers, but we'll see. So the December talk is also going to be awesome. So we've got a very interesting lineup for the rest of the year, and what time is it? 7 o'clock is when we were going to start. 6:56 to 4 minutes early.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks everyone.
One last question.
Please,
Can I make a quick?
Yes, I'll give before. Yeah, that was what I was going to say. We do have a door price. Anybody who's read this book? It was released like last week. Peter Thiel's 1, 2, and I know Josh has read it months ago. Anybody else? Okay, Andrew and CK. So this is a fantastic book. It's a collection of all his whatever lectures he taught at Stanford and Blake Masters. So if you'd seen a speech 2 years ago at South by, he gave lecture number 13 there, which is great. Anyway, this is a fantastic book on challenging our traditional ideas, conventions. So this is the door price for today, and the best price goes to whomever Andrew wants to give. It could be the one that asks the most insightful question, or the person tweets the most number of times with the hashtag Product Austin.
And on that note, so if you don't already know, there's a Capital Factory guest Wi-Fi network, and the password is the factory. So if you want to tweet, you need to get connected, and that's how you do it.
Great, thank you. Thank you for, I second the book recommendation, first of all, and thanks for having me here. Thanks to Prabhakar, Roger, and Josh for inviting me. It's a real privilege, and I'm glad I don't have to follow Noah Kagan. I can go before him. He's a really entertaining speaker, so the next one should be really good. I'm going to speak about designing culture. I'll try not to go too long. I'll try to keep it informal, leave a lot of time for questions. If you have any, please interrupt me, and without further ado, I'll just give a little background. So I co-founded and I'm co-CEO of MainStreetHub. There's my Twitter handle as I'm searching for more followers. The bit of a history on the company is we launched in 2009, actually 2010 as MainStreetHub, but got together with my co-founder in 2009, started a different kind of company in the local business space, learned enough about local businesses to pivot out of that idea, and that was in 2010. That was up in San Francisco, so we moved down to Austin in 2011, opened up offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York in 2012. Those are sales offices. Our headquarters is here. And then we just signed up, or about to sign up our 5,000th customer this month. So thank you very much. We're really excited about the progress we're making. We had 9 employees at the end of 2010. We have 353 employees right now, and we're shooting for about 500 by end of year. So we're kind of on a hiring tear. We started at 160 in January this year. Yeah, so we're trying to keep busy over there. And it's been a lot of fun. And Austin's been phenomenal to us. I'm not from Texas. We had no ties here, but it was the right city for our company. We moved down, and it's just been a blast. We've grown a bunch, and so we have some thoughts on culture, which I'm going to speak about. It's really driven our growth, and we view it as a competitive advantage, because ultimately, if we have the right culture, then we're attracting the right people who are building the right products, and that's going to help us win in our market. So we spend a lot of time thinking about it. Of course, we spend a lot of time iterating on our products, but we've asked ourselves to spend at least as much time iterating on our culture. And the nice thing is that a lot of the same techniques apply. And so I'm going to go through about 6 of them pretty briefly, and then we can get to questions. So understanding a cultural hedgehog concept. So a lot of you guys have probably read Good to Great by Jim Collins. This is another solid read. And in that book, he talks about a hedgehog concept. It's based off this quote, which says, the fox knows many things and the hedgehog knows one important thing. And the idea behind that is that the fox is pretty wily. He can think of different ways to attack the hedgehog, but all the hedgehog has to do is curl up into a ball and defend against that, do it every time, and it'll win every time. So it's really a quote about focus, and he applies it to company strategy and product strategy, but we think of it as a fit for thinking about a cultural strategy. So it's a combination of 3 different ideas. What are you passionate about? What can you be best in the world at? And what drives your economic engine? And for us, and the concept itself is the intersection of those things. For us, at MainStreetHub, the concept is empathy for our local business customers. So we're passionate about serving local businesses. Our mission is to create thriving local economies. We believe we can be best in the world at understanding that customer. And we also think that if we hire people who feel the same way, then it'll drive our economic engine. Ultimately, it'll start from hiring the right folks. So we've adopted empathy for local business customers as our cultural hedgehog concept, but for every company it might be a little bit different. And it was eye-opening to us to apply that framework to culture and start to plan the business culture around that. The second product management philosophy that we applied to culture too is getting out of the building from Steve Blank's book, 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And that's probably not an unfamiliar topic to everyone here. It's about getting on site with your customers, getting out of the whiteboard room spending time with the people who are hopefully going to buy your product. And the point of that, of course, is testing whether the problem you think you are solving is actually a valid one, an important one to your customer. Well, we think of sort of not the best analogy, but we think of our employees as the customers of our culture. I mean, they're also the manufacturers of it, but we've adopted the idea of trying to get out and spending time with the team to really ask them actually what they value about the culture and get that feedback as much as possible about parts of the culture, things that they're experiencing, getting that feedback, whether it's in small meetings or town halls or one-on-ones or coffees or office hours, which we hold weekly, but making sure that we can ask them direct questions about aspects of the culture, whether it's our values or hiring or any other topic, and then getting their direct feedback. We actually did this about a year ago. My co-founder Matt and I, we flew to the other offices as well as spent some time in Austin and had breakfast and lunch with every member of the team over the course of about a 4-week period, and in small groups, and we were able to have an open-ended conversation, hear how their day-to-day experiences have been, hear how they think our professional development is, hear how they think our hiring and team building is actually performing, and actually encourage a bit of debate too between the different folks in those meetings, which is really constructive. So we try to build that into our day-to-day, week-to-week through regular sessions on regular open office hours, regular town halls, regular small group coffees with the team, just to make sure that we're constantly checking in and hearing directly from the team how their experience at the company is progressing. A third example, probably even more familiar, is this build, measure, learn feedback loop from probably many places, but probably most famously from the Lean Startup. And we use that in rolling out policies, processes, cultural initiatives all the time. We think of everything in the company as a prototype, ultimately. And the best example of that is, well, first, just in case you're not familiar with what the build, measure, learn feedback loop is, it's essentially this. And putting out a prototype, rapid prototyping, measuring the results of that, learning from that, driving insights that then lead to version 2, and going faster and faster around that loop. Well, we did that with our PTO policy, which is not the most exciting thing you can think of at a company, but we started out just very quickly. We thought that a PTO policy that was 5 days of sick time and 10 days of vacation time a year would be great, and everyone would love that because you wouldn't be pressured to use your sick time for your vacation and vice versa, and people would stay healthy and not save their time on the beach by coming in sick. Well, it didn't go that well, and folks were generally felt confined by it and constrained by it. We heard about it through all sorts of channels. People weren't using their days. Town hall feedback was negative on it. So we just decided to, okay, that was a good test, but now we've really learned the feedback from the team. We know that it's not the most successful policy role that we've ever had. Let's change it. And we shifted to sort of a 15 days, whatever you want to use it for policy, which itself has gotten some mixed reviews, so we'll probably change it again. But it's an example of, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about all the possible gotchas. It seemed like a reasonable approach, and we wanted to test the assumption, and so we just rolled it out. And as long as we're broadcasting that to the team, this is a prototype, we're going to test it, setting expectations properly, getting them comfortable with that approach that we have, then the changes aren't that disruptive. One way in which we've really tried to adopt this testing, not sort of market research-driven approach to product development or design is in our employment practices, our hiring. And this is another philosophy we borrowed from Eric Ries's book. So we think of the interview process like market research in that you don't really learn what the truth is, you kind of learn what people think the truth is. And we've tried to de-risk the interview process as much as possible by putting into place a test, essentially, several tests in the process to really get a sense of whether the person is a good fit for the culture and the demands of the job. One way we do that is to ask questions that reveal culture fit. Another way we do that is to assign assignments that really simulate the job and simulate more than just the task, but actually how you'll do the work. So we do an interview process for sure, and we have lots of people interview candidates actually, but we put a lot of our faith into things like a work product assignment where we'll give someone on a 36-hour deadline a project that is basically something they would do in the role as much as we can without actually having to train them up on the job. And it tells us a lot about whether they're going to be a good fit with how we work. So some folks obviously don't return it at all, so you learn something there. Some folks, something really important, some folks turn it around almost immediately. You can tell they got right to work on it and then returned it. Some folks return it at 11:59 p.m. if the deadline is midnight, and you learn something there. And of course, you get a chance to review the quality of the output itself. But you learn a lot. There's a lot of data points in simply assigning a project. And sometimes it's not so obvious what that project might be, but there's usually one that if you spend enough time, you can figure out what it should be. And having one is just infinitely better than not. Another one we've used is just the why do you want to work here question. We get a lot of folks who answer that question with, well, I want to work at a startup, which is different than the folks who say, well, I love local businesses and I really want to work for a company that helps local businesses. In that moment, we've learned a ton about what their motivations are and whether they're fit with, again, going back to our headshot concept idea of being local business focused. From that one question, we've been able to derive a lot. Number 5 of 6 here is embracing constraints, and this is from a book called Switch, which is a great book by Chip and Dan Heath. They also wrote a book called Made to Stick, which is strong. And our view is that sort of like with an overfunded company, which can lead to fewer monetary constraints, of course, the startups with fewer cultural constraints are maybe more likely to go awry. And we try to shape the path by limiting our options in decision making or in anything else in managing the company. Shaping the path is this idea from the Switch book. Just imposing constraints on your decision making to make sure that you'll always make the hard decision, but the one you need to make. So for us, that's very present in our company values, which we try to use as much as possible as decision making tools. One example is this win-win-win framework. So it's one of our values, win-win-win, and the idea behind it is that we can't make a decision unless it's in the best interest of the customer, our team, and the company. And 2 out of 3 is not good enough. It has to be all 3. As a result, we are, if you can do this enough where it becomes routine, you end up, where you can check your decisions against your values pretty frequently, you end up with the right decision, hopefully more often than not. And then finally, composting your unsuccessful cultural initiatives. So this is, I'll go back to the PTO policy here. This is from, this is sort of a screenshot of a website, harrisonmetal.com. They're an investor in MainStreetHub. Michael Deering, who runs the fund, also produces these really great videos, which are about 3 minutes long or 5 minutes long, and they're really just helpful and also entertaining. So if you go to that site, there's like 10 or 12 of them, and you spend a good hour and a half and get a lot out of it. So what Harrison Metal says is they liken sort of product design and product development to, or at least one piece of it, to gardening. And the idea is in a garden you have compost, and compost makes the soil ultimately more productive. and they continue by saying, in design thinking, compost makes your brain more productive. So the idea, though, is that compost doesn't really work. It doesn't really become compost once you keep it out in the open. So when you have an idea or initiative and it doesn't go well, or it's not quite ready for prime time, the idea is to keep that in the public view. So refer back to it, keep it on in your swim lanes, whatever it is. Keep that idea in the public view so you can reinforce why it was a bad thing. Hopefully it'll help make the other decisions, the other initiatives go better. The example that I would cite from our experience doing this is anonymous feedback channels. So we had, a while back, a anonymous texting product that we got a subscription to, where folks could just text feedback to myself and my co-founder whenever they wanted to, and it would be anonymous. And it was a good product. Then Google bought it and it killed it, unfortunately. But it was a good product until that happened. And we found though that it was sort of going off the rails because all the bad parts of anonymity, all the possible byproducts of anonymity that are negative were potentially or sort of appearing here and there. And we thought, well, we have to have some anonymous channels for sure, but we should probably try to bend the culture towards transparency, towards straightforwardness, towards being direct. One of our values is speak up, so we wanted to reinforce that. So we pulled back from having these anonymous feedback channels, and the results have been great. Not because they're gone, which is good, but also because we can talk about why we made that decision and what the kind of culture is that we're trying to put into place in the company, and why we're trying to promote speaking up and what good things that leads to. So this ultimately failed initiative we don't sweep it under the rug, we just refer to it all the time to drive the right kind of decisions, the right kind of behavior, and that's the compost that I'm talking about there. So these are the 6 design and design thinking and product management processes or principles that we've tried to apply to our building up a culture. And I hope that's helpful and interesting. And with that, I'm happy to take questions from Josh or the group.
I think Josh is great.
Great, thank you.
I also want to mention one thing. Yes. So for those of you who don't know, Andrew's background is in law. He had a JD MBA from Stanford, before that from Yale, and he used to write policy speech writing. This is the second best talk I've heard after Dan Pink, because Dan Pink also has a similar thread on these topics. So something to do with lawyers quitting their, or not doing law and going.
Highly recommended.
All right, great. Well, thank you again, Andrew. That's awesome. I'm Josh Duncan, and I'm going to moderate the Q&A here. So I have a question to start things off, and then afterwards, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic around. And I'm assuming are we being taped or not? Is it on the live stream tonight? No? I don't know. All right. Well, we might be on the live stream. Maybe. All right. So
There's a second mic there.
I got it. So I'll just pass it around. So raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. So Andrew, I guess to start with, we have a lot of product people in the room here. And I've heard a lot about culture. This is one of the first times I've heard someone kind of explain not only how they came up with it, how they tested it, and again, it was very lean startup kind of esque. So when did you guys come up with the idea, and how did you kind of develop this framework? Were you in the life cycle of the company? Were you getting started and doing product stuff, and then like it occurred to you that, hey, we should build our culture like this too? Again, kind of walk us through the genesis of how do you get to this point or develop this theory?
Sure. Well, my co-founder and I met up. We were mutually introduced by some friends, and we were introduced because we both cared a lot about building a company with a great culture, and I guess we were droning on about it enough that they said you guys should meet. So the interest in building a company that has an accelerating effect on its people's careers and having a great culture was there a little bit from the beginning. But I mentioned the pivot. We started with a business that committed all the cardinal sins of product development. We built this very functional product before we got enough customer feedback, before we really put it in their hands. We didn't do the feedback process well enough. We ultimately launched it, and it didn't go nearly as far, as fast as we would have liked. But that process, about 9-month process, taught us the hard way a lot of the product development lessons that I mentioned before, and that these books pioneered. That experience also taught us to sort of regard everything as a prototype. And that became a bit of a mantra for us. And then as the company grew and the need for more structured organization, process, policy, everything grew, we just took those lessons and applied it to that. So it was a bit of a product of doing everything, not everything, but almost everything incorrectly the first time around.
That's great. Let me ask one more last question before turning it over. Do you have a backlog then of ideas that are being prioritized right now by your HR product manager?
That's actually great. Not in the most structured way we possibly could. We probably should do that, but not yet. Not yet.
Anyone else want to go?
So I have a question about your interviewing process. So I liked what you said about given a 36-hour assignment. So does that mean that you put less or little value on the quick thinking, kind of weird question right off the top of your hat, come up with the, how many fleas in the state of Texas or something? You don't like those type of questions?
That's probably true. Yeah, we don't ask those sort of famous or McKinsey or Google type interview questions that I know other companies do. We do have a pretty lengthy interview process. We actually try to put each person in front of 4 or 5 people who are going to be peers, managers, more senior than that. Get those folks in the room, have the most junior folks go first in terms of their feedback, and then go around the table that way to get everyone's feedback out. And if folks are not answering the following 2 questions in the affirmative, we don't hire the person. It's, are you passionate about working with this person? Do they raise the bar for future hires? The latter is one that I think we borrowed from Amazon. And that process has worked out pretty well, but I think the linchpin is really the work product assignment. Thank you.
So on CNBC the other morning, it was just a complete coincidence, there was a couple of guests on, and they were talking about a new book that's out called Learn or Die. And I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it might be worth checking out because it's like very closely related to this topic, and it's about basically learning organizations and how you build learning organizations and cultures. So I was surprised to hear that topic on CNBC, no less, but just FYI.
Thanks.
Thank you for a great speech and putting together a wonderful culture.
Thank you very much.
So my question is this, and I'm also in the process of including a bunch of other companies. The challenge I always face is, are you looking at culture first, competencies next, or competencies first, culture next, or where exactly on the spectrum do you put the needle on? Because in my opinion, if you don't have a good culture, and depending on the kind of role you're at, a lot of those competencies can be learned very quickly. But culture is something that you really, if you don't, either you have it or you don't. Now, how do you guys think about it, and how do you test that out, and how do you do that, and where you kind of?
Yeah, I'd agree. We would put, if forced to choose, for sure, we put culture above competency 10 times out of 10. And for a lot of the reasons you said, I think if they're the right fit for the team, they're going to learn to do. It's oversimplification for sure, but ultimately it's the people who are building the company and building the product, and so we're trying to get the culture to be right first every single time. And we've in the past not moved forward with several really impressive, experienced candidates because the culture fit just didn't work. And it's painful in the short term. Vacancies stay open for a little bit longer than you might like. but I don't think we always valued that as much as we could have in the first couple of years of the business. Felt a little bit of the pain there and resolved to make those long-term choices and incur the short-term pain every time.
All right, I'm gonna go here, then I'm gonna come up that way.
Hey, so the topic for the talk was really interesting because obviously growing culture is huge, but I'm more impressed that you're growing it at such scale. You're like quadrupling your company. I guess my question's in two parts. The first part is how do you keep up with that, and how do you kind of have that transparency of the business objectives? I like the hedgehog effect, but how do you get like these new hires on board with your vision, knowing about your product decisions from every facet of the company? And the second question is, how do you deal with poor culture fits that are already in the organization?
Great questions. There are a couple of different answers to that. Certainly, even though we're scaling quickly, the recruiting process I described earlier has to stay the way it is. So we force ourselves to stick to the process that we think works pretty well. And that takes up more time, but not compromising on the hiring piece, making sure we're answering those two questions in the affirmative has to happen even though we're trying to hire 100 people in a quarter. Once they're being onboarded, we want to make sure that they're getting a good sense of the culture they're joining and getting their questions answered for sure, but also getting as much awareness as possible over how we work in the company. A couple of things we've done in that regard have been we have a 100-slide culture presentation on our website, and we're actually about to. We added 30 slides, so it'll be 130 soon, but we haven't uploaded the new version yet. But it's a long presentation on culture, and it kind of describes the kind of culture that we think we have at the company. So that's there for recruits, for people who are browsing the careers page, but it's also, so hopefully there's some self-selection there, but also either Matt or I sit down with each group, each new cohort over coffee, and we take them through the presentation. So that time is really effective. And of course, we leave plenty of time for questions. So, because by the 5th day on the job, there are a lot of questions that have been built up around the company and its direction and what we're trying to do. So we answer those too. But that ritual is really important to making sure folks who come on board have a good and quick sense of who we're trying to be. And then finally, I think it all comes down to the frontline managers on the team. Because now that we have 300, close to 400 people, you have to get other people in the company who can also help train up and manage the folks towards the kind of culture and goal that we have. And so investing in training and mentoring frontline managers who might be new to management, they might have been frontline employees and then they get promoted to management, or they might be from the outside, but either way, they're likely earlier in their management career. But they have tremendous influence over the entire company, especially the 8 to 15 people they might manage. So we've tried to really double down on training and mentorship at that level.
So let me add just a quick tail question on that, Andrew, because I know it sounds like you have several offices now, and I've seen this personally, how hard it is to have kind of that home-based culture extend. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you guys have done some stuff there with the breakfasts and stuff, but could you talk about when you consciously started having more offices, what you did to make sure the culture wasn't just, oh, that's something they do in Austin, and here in New York we do it this way?
Yeah, a couple of different things. One is we sent folks to open the office. So typically each time we open an office, 2 or 3 folks from Austin would move to that city and open it. And they initially were able to get some of those habits, traditions, cultural elements going from the get-go and make it familiar. And of course, the rest of the team knows that they've moved from Austin or from New York and are listening when they're talking, listening when they're doing, when they're putting into place these things. It's really easy to make headquarters something special, like you're saying, and it's I think dangerous because I think you kind of have to make sure that whatever you do at headquarters you can actually deliver elsewhere and hold yourself to that standard. Otherwise, I completely agree. You can subject yourself to a second-class citizen status in the company for the satellite office folks. So we just, if we're rolling out anything really, any kind of cultural initiative, any kind of team building initiative, any kind of availability to the team, it has to be something that we can scale up remotely. Otherwise, we just pass.
So you talked about how you can prioritize culture over trying to select skill sets. It seems like with smaller companies, people feel like maybe they need to find someone that no one in the company knows how to do a particular task. So it gets, maybe the skill set gets prioritized over culture. And my perception, and I haven't worked in a 500-person company, but my perception is that maybe as you get bigger, you can grow in a way where you can anticipate the needs and you don't need to do that as much. So I'm wondering, is that true? And does that, and also for the smaller companies that still feel like they do need to do that, do you have any recommendations for them?
Sure. It's only my opinion, but I would actually think the same challenges exist at our scale as it did when we were sub 10 people. And my advice would be to hold out and endure that pain and try to figure out how you can plug holes in the meantime. It's challenging, especially if you're early on and there's an entire skill set you don't have in the company. But if there's some way to just extend your search a little bit longer to hold a high bar, it's going to pay off. The extra week, month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever it is, I think will pay off in the long run. If this is someone who, I imagine because they're filling some key role in the company, they're likely going to be integral to its success and longevity in the first several years at least. So it's definitely worth it, in my opinion.
So once again, thank you. Other people have mentioned thank you. Culture for me, huge topic. Getting the right hires, bringing people that understand. It's about people, and it's really about loving people, loving the customers. And without that, you're going to fail. So I work also in a large organization. Not so much a question, but more hammering home this point. Again, really near and dear to my heart. Work in a large organization that values culture, and I've seen time and time again where we've compromised. We've said, okay, we're hiring for aptitude over attitude, and it has kicked us in the butt every time. And it's kicked us in the butt by these folks that we bring in. They're toxic to other folks, and it's so expensive to reverse the decision. So again, just driving that nail a little bit deeper, higher. You need attitude, and it's often more important than aptitude.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sorry, provokers asked me what company I work for. So I work for Rackspace.
Yeah, the first thing I heard a lot of things that were flags for me in a positive sense. One of them was how quickly you seem to acknowledge where you get your ideas and you document that. I think that's a really interesting kind of a way to find patterns that are relevant. The vast majority of us, I've had 7 companies and I've hired a number of times. And I've made 1 or 2 semi-fatal mistakes. And when they became conscious to me, was not in the hiring process, it wasn't in the test run, it wasn't in the pilot period. It was under a different level of stress that was threatening or intimidating or devastating to the other person. And we got to see a side that we had no reason to trigger up until then. And that's the most difficult thing. Like, what do you do when suddenly the emperor has no clothes and there are high talent, high deliverable, but their ethics are kind of out of order.
Yeah.
So, and I'll give you a tiny piece of background.
Sure.
I'm a very specialized kind of systems therapist by background who only work with whole families all in the room at the same time. Before I started, that was my 5th business before I started the business I have now, which is my 7th. And it's just amazing what happens under stress in those situations. So when you get a disappointment like, similar to that, what's the first thing you do, and then what's the second thing you do?
Well, I think you have to, and I'm only on my first company, so take my advice with a grain of salt. You've been through 7. I'd love to hear your answer to this question, frankly. But you have to assess the nature of the breach first, I think. How much of a breach is it? And is it something where there's, where the action to be taken is a serious conversation, or is the action a little more severe? And whatever the action is, on any part of that scale, my opinion is to do it right away. Even if you're in the midst of some disastrous situation that caused this side to reveal itself.
So what would be your action of preference?
I think it depends on the nature of the misalignment.
Well, let's say it involved dishonesty and potential embezzlement.
Well, then I never took the bar, but there are a couple of things I'd probably advise in that situation.
I forgot about the law background.
I tried to forget about the law back. No, I'm kidding. I think immediately you want them out of your company, locked out of your systems, and I think you call whoever you have to call authority-wise to get that taken care of.
So one chance and you're out on that.
Oh yes, absolutely. One chance and you're out. If you're starting a company, you're early on in a company, you're far along in a company, there's a lot riding on that organization, and whether that's the investors or the employees or the customers or whomever. And our view has been you don't get a lot of room for error.
Yeah. My first time that happened, I sent a two-person team on the road, and ended up with a really serious harassment issue. And ironically, it was not the man, it was the woman in that case, which left me kind of speechless, but it shouldn't have, because in my family history, therapy background, even though everybody thinks men are the abusers, let me tell you what, it is 50-50, equal opportunity, for sure, when it comes to real abuse. But in that case, I was able to have a really frank talk. This person had never had a mentor and never really had a role model, and came from a really tough background and then ended up getting a ton of education and a ton of training, but had no history of modeling, in her history. And we gave her one more chance with no questions asked about how fine the line was that we were expecting, because we saw that immediately maybe spreading to client kind of thing as well. We were just fortunate that the guy happened to be close enough to us to tell us.
Was it the right decision?
Yes, actually, she deserved another chance, and she broke her neck, earning it. And we never saw that again. We had her for about 7 years after that. And it probably might have saved her. She was married, by the way, and it might have saved the marriage, too. Very clear, no if or when, this is it, never again, ever, in any way.
Yeah, and my view, thanks for sharing that. My view is doesn't matter if it's your top performer in engineering, in sales, or whatever it is. I think that if there's an ethical line in your company, then you cross it, and that's that.
Yeah, and in terms of all the female stuff going on right now, it should always start at the top. It's always what the top culture will permit, and it applies for men and women. But I agree with you, the culture's it.
I'm going to sneak another question in here. Andrew, you talked about getting out of the building and what you guys have done there, and obviously that's a great product management principle. We talk a lot about getting out of the building, meeting the customers, and you also talk about how much your customers are important to you. And I know we've seen this, I've seen this in the past, the struggle of where you have the product management team that's getting a lot of customer research and understanding the customer, but then how do you bring that back into the rest? I mean, you're now 300 plus people. I'm sure a lot of them might have different levels of experience with really understanding small businesses. They can't all have come from a small business background. So how do you bring that kind of outside the company culture in so they really understand it as well as what the product team would do?
Sure. Well, a couple of different things that we do. One is we try to make sure that when we're rolling out changes to, say, our product, we're actually doing an explanation of why it came about and what we observed and what behavior we're seeing and why this is the right solution and all of that. So we don't just say, here's the new product, here's how we're testing it, but why? Secondly, actually, one thing we've picked up, we've done it about 3 years in a row now, is we send an email to the company every day that tells a story about how our product has worked for a customer. So we have someone in the company in our people group whose job it is to do that. And it's part of her job, but it's this write-up, and it describes who the customer is, when they came on board, where they are, what they do, just as much of the customer as we can fit in, and then how our product worked for them, or how it impacted them, or what the situation was, or that sort of thing. The purpose of that actually is twofold. One is to increase familiarity with our customer base across the team. Not everyone's customer facing. And two is to actually educate the team on the product, because not everyone actually sees that in action all the time either. So whether you're in sales or in customer success or marketing or finance or what have you, just being able to get that broad view of the product in all its applications is part of the purpose of that tradition.
Okay, my name is Dan. I have a question that everybody here asked about young companies and lean startup and things like that. I want to ask a different question. So let's say you have a company that is brick and mortar company, about 56 years old. They have the way, they have definitely their culture. So the question is, how can you interleave into that culture a new product that is high-tech product such as mobile apps? Okay. So I asked the interviewer today, I was in an interview today in that company, I asked him, so what is your, when it came my turn to ask questions at the end, what is your personal management style? I didn't mention anything about culture. So he said, so the culture here is very much waterfall, and our goal is to incorporate agile because of the high tech that we want to get into. So I got a little dizzy because of that, because I asked him about his personal style. He answers about the legacy culture that they have, and what they need is agile. Can you say anything about how you interview these questions? You have a very old culture with all the methodologies, and you need to incorporate the new methodology into that.
I'll take my best guess, which would, I think, if there is this mature culture, then it probably has a vernacular, a set of principles, words even, that the culture has ideas, goals, the culture has sort of formed around over time. And I wonder how those might apply to whatever the new thing is. So if you can introduce the new thing and using literally the principles, ideas, but also the words that the company uses, I'm sure there are some, then potentially just drawing the connection between how it fits. Not to be too vague, if you're driving at change, then of course you want to be clear about that. But if you're trying to show then how there's a connection or how it's the next natural step, then I think getting into the real language of the existing culture is the way to go. One way we knew that our ideal culture was taking root in the company was we started to hear phrases from our culture presentation just around in the hallway, here and there. In conference rooms, you could hear people employing those words and phrases. And when it's not forced like that, when it's just sort of second nature, when it's in conversation, I think is a great indicator for whether the culture is really permeated across the team.
Thanks for coming. I don't know where I read it or heard it, but something someone said that resonated with me about culture is that you should really focus on that really early on, because in your first 10 or 15 people, you're setting the DNA of your company that's going to be replicated over and over. And so the question is do you agree with that? And if so, is there anything that you would caution us to be sure to do or to not do to set that DNA?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think it's possible to change course, but it takes a lot of work, and I think the amount of work probably increases exponentially as time goes on and the team grows. So getting it right early is really important, but getting it wrong early is not fatal, okay. I think.
Did you make any big mistakes? Or?
Yes, yeah. But if the camera's on, I'm not going to go into all of them. But, oh yeah, absolutely. And we had to undo all sorts of mistakes that I'm sure some we probably realized and some we probably didn't realize at the time or shortly thereafter. And the ones that we were really, I think it all comes back to the question about attitude versus aptitude. We found that where we were really strict about something from the get-go, if it was short-term painful, it's really taken root and been long-term, been a propellant in the long term. And where we didn't always hold ourselves to that standard necessarily, or didn't really realize that that was a moment to do that, we just had to unwind a little bit too. But it's not a disaster.
So I'm going to be selfish and ask you another question, right? So, two things, right? So one is about culture. You want to have a very strong culture, but as times move on, you do need to evolve, right? So you should have a vision, but you need to keep evolving. That's one. On the second hand, if you're bringing this product-oriented approach towards culture, when you do product design or product marketing, you inevitably end up making compromises, right? So keeping these two things in mind, how do you still end up making compromises on the culture front? Yeah. At the same time, future-proof yourself, not becoming a sellout, because eventually other pressures come in. How do you think about that? Because I know you may not have an answer right now, but how do you think about it?
Sure, that's a great question. Let me see if I can answer it in a way that's helpful. I think in some respects, by definition, the culture kind of is a compromise. What I mean by that is not that you're compromising your values necessarily or anything like that. I wouldn't recommend that, but it's not set from the first two people in the company. It has to evolve over time. It has to respond to who you're bringing in. That's why it's important to bring in great people, of course, from the beginning. But it becomes the product of the team, and it's kind of in the control of the leadership. I think there is a way to drive that for sure, but it has to work for the team you're bringing in. It has to be their culture too. And so some of the feedback that we get, the iterations that we make, are because the customer or the team in this case is driving. It has behaviors, has needs like any customer, and we have to make sure we're meeting those. And that might veer us away from what we thought it was going to be when we were in the ideation stage.
But how do you future-proof it? How do you think about creating some framework that says, we're going down this path, we're talking to a whole bunch of engineers, say, you're in Albuquerque, you've seen Breaking Bad.
Sure, yeah.
You support the meth industry. Right? So how do you future-proof and say, no, I would never do that? How do you think about that?
If I understand correctly, I think it comes down to get the values done early. We had the values before we had meaningful revenue. Get the hiring process done right, at least so you can iterate on it and get something out there and then learn from it and then find the process that works for you and stick to it, hell or high water. And then onboard folks well so that they're not left adrift and then ultimately not able to succeed in the culture that you're trying to create. So it just comes down to, I think, the fundamentals of hiring, onboarding, and then having those core values, which it should be really actionable. It should be able to hire and fire based on the values. It should be something that drives a decision, because as the company evolves, you're just endlessly facing decisions that have no precedent. You need a framework for making those decisions. That should be the values that you have. So ideally, they're comprehensive enough to account for broadly the situations you might face.
Hi, so maybe you already answered some of these questions, but I'm going to ask because I'm curious. So you talked about setting the attitudes and the values early on, but these attitudes and values are not set in stone, right? As time evolves, you might find yourself personally evolving, your authenticity improving, and things like that. So how do you trickle those values down to the new hires and people who have already been in the organization for a while, and how do they evolve, and how does that whole thing mesh together?
Great. So, well, first, if you come to our office, and we're just across the street in the Perry Brooks building at 720 Brazos, if you come to our office, you'll see that our values are up in posters on the wall. Our hedgehog concept is up in posters around the wall. So there's a bit of reinforcement there and a bit of awareness. So maybe you're at your desk, you're on a hard problem, maybe there's a guide for you on the wall. We take people through the culture presentation early on. Ideally, they've gone through it themselves in the hiring process, but if they haven't, we'll make sure they go through it in their first few days on the job so we can teach them about the kind of culture that we have. But like you said, it's not set in stone. So I'll give an example of that is we have monthly town hall meetings. We had our October town hall meeting today. In our September town hall meeting, we talked about our values in that meeting. And we ran through them again because we've hired so many people that we thought it was nice to spend a lengthy amount of time talking about them. At the end of the presentation, we asked, there are 7 values. We asked for nominations for an 8th. Like, what's missing? What shouldn't be there anymore, maybe? How do we edit this? We actually just said, hey, this is not like, it's on a stone tablet. So how should we change this now that we've evolved as a company, now that we have new people in, we've learned more? We'll likely be proposing an 8th value at our next town hall in November. So being very open about the fact that it's a living document, it's a living process.
How do you find your personal values changing over time, though, and how do you reflect that?
I think it's a good question. I don't know how much personal values have changed over time in the company. I think what is more likely is just there are more personal values involved in the company. So it's more like a dilution in a way, and you're trying to find what the common organizing principles are around the culture. I don't mean to have a cop-out on your question here, but I don't think that our individual values have changed. I think that what we've learned, I think that as the teams have grown, situations have arisen, cultures have arisen on the teams, and how do we reflect that in our values? What do we want to explicitly keep, and what might we want to sort of implicitly carve out by virtue of its non-inclusion in the values? Thank you.
Hi. So do you ever, when you said you evaluate your values and ask feedback from people within the company, suppose there's a value in which you feel that something is not working, do you at least have an outside-in perspective in terms of maybe it's everyone within the company is bought into the culture and bought into these values, but it might not be producing the benefits for your product or your solution or whatever you're marketing. It might not be generating the outcome you achieved. So is there any time when you actually have an outside-in perspective of figuring out whether it's a value problem or a product solution problem?
Great question. And it could be a communication or education problem in between the two. Because you might have values that would say the right thing, but ultimately they're not making its way into the product, or into the people doing the work. So that's probably inevitable because you're gonna, like any kind of product, it comes up against the real world at some point. But I think that probably is. That probably comes from a bit of a post-mortem process, or almost like a 5 whys kind of process, to borrow another Eric Ries-ism. Just asking why 5 times to get to the root cause of what the problem is. And if you find that it's, well, our product team doesn't know what the company strategy is, or our success team doesn't know what we're trying to get across with this product, or whatever the example might be. I think that probably reveals whether it's a values problem, whether whatever the problem is wasn't contemplated, whether it's an execution problem on the product side, or whether it's just a matter of, had everyone known all the information, or at least more of it, we would have gotten the right result.
It's a good time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions here.
Thank you. Gladwell has his rule of 150. My company actually grew through acquisition really, really fast and went from 150 to 2,000 in about 2 years. So when you're growing more organically, is there a tipping point at some point where you see that you have to evolve and change the culture, or just it gets a lot harder to keep it?
Yeah, I think the 150 number is actually pretty accurate. Surprisingly, we crossed that number in 2012, I think, and the challenge there is that, and that gets back to the point about having strong management, strong leaders broadly throughout the team, because you can't drive a culture if you aren't spending a lot of time with each member of the team. But there is always somebody in the company who's spending a lot of time with each member of the team. It just happens to be a lot more people than it used to be. And I think that's where it becomes really apparent how important scaling your leadership is. And that's where I think the organizational energy, the cultural energy, the hiring energy, the people department energy needs to really reside, is bridging that transition by developing leaders throughout the organization at any level in the organization to act according to the values, to be able to mentor new people, to be able to lead by example, whatever the need is. That was absolutely a tipping point for us.
Hi, I'd like for you to talk a bit more about your cultural constraints, how that evolved, what is important in your company.
Sure. So we grew through. We didn't raise very large early stage rounds as we grew in the first couple of years, and so we got an appreciation for what a resource constraint can do for focusing on the right problem. And I think that was actually great for our company. And I think that awareness got us thinking about how that philosophy, or how that phenomenon can be applied to all sorts of things. In this case, the culture. So our 7 values just are reverence for local business, challenge yourself, elevate others, speak up, win, 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 and I am MainStreetHub. I think I got 7 there. And by making sure that we're bringing those values up, and we do this, it's easy to say, and this might sound a little bit superficial, but we really talk about them a lot in the company. And by making sure that we are that we are talking about them constantly, we get in the habit of deciding upon them. So if an idea comes across or a suggestion comes across, we can be pretty straightforward in saying, I don't think that fits with our value of challenging ourselves because X, or if someone is being particularly critical without any kind of constructive element to it, and just being negative or even angry or yelling, we can talk about, not that that happens at MainStreetHub, but you can talk about elevate others as our approach, which is all about lifting people up with positivity, but also constructive feedback. So the values themselves, if you talk about them enough, end up being things that people are comfortable citing, and so you can catch a bad idea or hopefully not a bad behavior early on, and just bring people back to this shared, agreed upon set of decision rules. I think the win-win-win value is probably the most explicit version of that, because it requires that the decision fit these three characteristics, but each of the values really is itself should be comprehensive across the 7 and should cover all these decisions, and if something's awry, then we just bring it back to the values, if that's helpful. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So you have a book to give away.
Okay. And does it have to go somewhere right now, or is there some contest element? Can we
36
check?
hours.
Sorry?
It's 36 hours.
36 hours? Oh, that's right. Oh,
it's a project.
Wow, okay. This is tough. Did anyone tweet with #ProductAustin during this event? Well, my company does word of mouth for small local businesses, and that's the kind of thing that we love to see, so I'll give it to you.
Great.
So there is pizza still in the back, and you are free to take it home with you if if there's some left over for you to take. And the next Product Austin meetup will be on November 6th on Thursday. Nope. Is that right? Yeah, November 6th on Thursday. And let's see. Oh, you will be getting, as Prabhakar mentioned earlier, an email to ask you about your experience here tonight. And it will include an NPS question, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's the Net Promoter Score. And it's probably a familiar question for you that will be along the lines of, would you recommend Product Austin to a colleague or someone else that you know? Let's see. Am I missing anything else? Josh? Prabhakar? Anybody else? All right, thank you very much.